Hi, this is Tracy Rich from Judaism 101, JEWFAQ.org. And today I'm going to tell you some things from the story of Purim that they may not have told you in Hebrew school, either because they're a little bit risque or because they are OCD, that's overly complicated details. The character pictures I have here to help tell the story are from ToriAV.com. They are Purim finger puppets that she made. So let's get to the Purim story. We start with King Ahasuerus, who was the Persian emperor. Some associate him with Xerxes I. He was throwing a big party, and he got very, very drunk. And he told his servants to bring his queen, Vashti, before him wearing her crown. And by that he means nothing but her crown. He wants her to come out and be paraded naked before his drunken friends. But she refused to do that. Now the rabbis are pretty convinced that Vashti didn't have any problem dancing around naked for her husband's friends, and that there were other things that caused her to refuse. The Creator gave her temporary spots or a tail. Or maybe she was just having a good time partying with her female friends and didn't want to be bothered. But whatever the reason, the king divorced her, possibly executed her, and decided to surround himself with a bunch of pretty young virgins. And yes, he uses the specific word virgins, betulot, not just young women. So it's at this point that we meet our heroes, Mordecai and his cousin Esther. Now, we frequently think of Mordecai as Esther's uncle, but actually it's very specific. She's the daughter of his uncle, his first cousin. Mordecai raised Esther from a child, and most translations say that he adopted her as his daughter. But Judaism doesn't have any such thing as adoption. The word is lekacha, which means took her, and it's a word that's used elsewhere for marriage, usually take her as a wife. The rabbis understand that actually Mordecai was married to Esther. They say, don't read it as took her as a daughter, labat, but read it as took her for a household, that is, labayit, very similar word. And you may be wondering, how can a man marry his cousin? Well, Jewish law doesn't actually prohibit that, and it was somewhat common in rabbinical families until fairly recently. In fact, I have an aunt whose grandparents were first cousins, born in the 1830s. So Esther is one of the beautiful virgins who are taken to the king in place of Vashti. But wait a minute, how could Esther be a virgin if she's Mordecai's wife? Well, traditionally there were two phases to the marriage. Kiddushin, which is sanctification, and Nisuin, elevation. And the couple didn't start having sex until that second phase, which was sometimes as much as a year later. So they could have been in that first phase. So Esther was taken to the king's household with all the pretty virgins and prepared to be part of his harem. And it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to figure out what's going on here. Each girl gets her turn. She's taken from the women's house at night to the king's house, and in the morning she goes to a different house, the house of the concubines. So she's not a pretty virgin anymore. But wait a minute, isn't this adultery for Esther if she's married to Mordecai and having this happen to her? Well, the rabbis get around this by saying that Esther didn't really have a choice about it, and that she didn't really participate. So what they're saying is she just laid there like a lump and let the king do what he wanted. Apparently the king liked that sort of thing because he loved her more than any of the other women, and he made her queen. Now we get back to Mordecai. Mordecai hears about a plot to kill the king, and he sends word to Esther, and the plotters are put to death. Now you may be wondering, how dumb are these plotters that they're talking in the open about killing the king? Well, there's a simple explanation for this that the rabbis put out there. The Persian Empire was very large with a lot of different nations and languages in it. The plotters were speaking in their native language, thinking that nobody would understand it. But Mordecai was a scholar who spoke 70 languages, and he knew what they were saying, so that's how he was able to reveal this plot. Then we get to chapter 3 of the book, where we meet Haman. We're supposed to blot out his name whenever we hear it. I'll try not to do that too much in this video. Haman is the villain. He's very much like Jafar in Disney's Aladdin, an advisor to the king, but not really very important himself. It says in the book that he's an Agagite, but what does that mean? Well, it means he's a descendant of King Agag of Amalek, the nation that attacked the Hebrews from behind when they were fleeing Egypt during the Exodus. And were commanded eternally to blot them out, like this. But they were still around in King Saul's time. In 1 Samuel 15, King Saul is told to destroy Amalek, But Saul captured their king Agag and spared him, a little professional courtesy. Saul lost favor in the Creator's eyes because of that. And now comes Haman, who is a descendant of King Agag. He is an Amalekite. Mordecai, by the way, is from the tribe of Benjamin. That's King Saul's tribe, and tradition tells us that Mordecai and Esther are descended from King Saul. So this is really a replay of the Saul-Agag situation, where Mordecai is going to defeat Haman. Yeah, I'm having too much fun with that grogger. Haman wanted everybody to bow down to him, and Mordecai refused to do that, saying because he was a Jew. This is possibly because Haman was an Amalekite, or possibly because Jews only bowed down to our Creator. But this put the idea in our villain's head to commit genocide. He put it to the king in words that are chillingly familiar. He said, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's law, and therefore it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them." How many times have we heard that? And the king, not being the brightest bulb in the box, went along with it and gave Haman permission to write up an edict to murder the Jews. Mordecai hears about it and tells Esther to plead with the king. And she says that you can't see the king unless he has summoned you, and if he hasn't summoned you, you'll be put to death. Unless, it says, he extends his golden scepter to you. Now, what is a golden scepter? Well, it's an ornamented staff that kings have. But there's also a part of the man's anatomy that he might extend to a woman if he was happy to see her. I haven't found the specific rabbinical source that says this, but it's pretty well understood that the scepter, in general, is a phallic symbol. Esther's other concern is adultery. Up to this point, her relationship with the king was not adulterous because it was involuntary and passive. That if she voluntarily goes into his presence and asks for a favor, that changes the nature of their relationship, and henceforth she will be forbidden to Mordecai, so she's very concerned about this. Suffice it to say that the king was happy to see Esther and extended his golden scepter to her. Esther, rather than bringing up the actual subject of her visit, invites the king and Haman to dinner. At the first dinner, she kind of chickens out, doesn't tell the king what she wants, and invites them back for another dinner. That night, the king's having some trouble sleeping, so he reads some history, because of course that always puts people to sleep. That's another thing your teachers don't want you to hear. And he reads about how Mordecai saved his life back in chapter 2. And he arranges for Haman to honor Mordecai, which of course really annoys Haman. It's around this time that Haman builds a 50-cubit stake to impale Mordecai on when the time comes. At the second dinner, Esther finally gets the nerve to tell the king that Haman's murderous plans are directed at her people. Remember, up to this point, she hasn't admitted that she's Jewish. And of course, Haman's plans also affect Mordecai, who the king was so recently reminded saved his life. The king was furious to hear this and left the room. Esther remains lying on the couch, as was the custom at festive dinners at the time. We talk about this at Passover, that reclining concept. And Haman throws himself next to her to beg for his life. The king comes back and sees Haman throwing himself on the reclining Esther and thinks he's trying to rape her. This is actually pretty explicit in most translations. And because of that, Haman gets impaled on the stake he planned for Mordecai. So now we're getting to the part where the Jewish people are saved, but there's a complication here that's not really very clear, so let's back it up a little bit. Back in chapter 3, the king gave Haman his signet and had Haman write up an edict to destroy the Jews and take their stuff. This edict was sealed with the king's signet. Now here in chapter 8, we're told that an edict sealed with the king's signet can't be revoked. Haman's edict for genocide back in chapter 3 is irrevocable. And the king, as I said, not being the brightest bulb in the box, gives Mordecai his signet and says, "Do whatever you want, but you can't revoke the previous order." So Mordecai thinks about it and he writes up an order that gives the Jews the right of self-defense, which may seem like an obvious thing, but they really didn't have the legal right to fight back when the others came to kill them if the king had ordered it. So with this new order allowing them to fight back, a lot of people had second thoughts about killing the Jews, and the ones who tried to were killed by the Jews in self-defense. That all happened on the 13th of Adar, and on the 14th of Adar, the Jews celebrated their survival and victory, but in big walled cities like Shushan, It took another day to get everything sorted out, so they didn't celebrate until the 15th. So Mordecai wrote up what happened and sent word throughout the empire that these days would be observed for feasting and merrymaking and sending gifts to each other and presents to the poor, and we continue to do that to this day. And that's the story of Purim. Thanks for joining me.